Her champagne trembled against the crystal tray when her sister said, "Nobody wants you here." The insult did not fall softly. It cracked across the ballroom like a glass snapped at the stem, sharp enough to turn heads 3 tables away. Eleanor Vale stood at the edge of the gala's gold-lit floor in a black silk dress she had altered herself at a kitchen table, her fingers still bearing the faint pinpricks from the hem. She had spent 32 years learning how to make herself smaller inside rooms built for people like her family. Rooms with marble columns, violin quartets, and women who smiled with their mouths while measuring weakness with their eyes. Tonight, that old training failed her. Vivian Vale held a champagne flute in one hand and a circle of attention in the other. Diamonds flashed at her throat like hard little blades. She leaned in just enough for the cruelty to feel intimate, then spoke loudly enough for nearby donors, socialites, and board members to enjoy it. "Nobody wants you," she said again, smiling this time. "You should have understood that when Mother didn't put your name on the main seating chart." A hush rippled outward, not from sympathy, but appetite. The rich loved humiliation when it came dressed in family blood. Eleanor felt it at once. The shift in the air, the subtle turning of shoulders, the half-hidden glances pretending not to look. One older woman covered her mouth. A man beside the auction display smirked into his drink. No one stepped in. Of course they did not. Because in this room, exclusion was its own language. Eleanor did not answer immediately. Her hand tightened around the stem of her glass until the cold bit into her skin. She was the younger Vale daughter, the one who had not married power, had not weaponized charm, had not learned to draw a crowd by starving someone else of oxygen. Her father had once called her too soft for strategy. Her mother called her difficult to place. Vivian had long ago settled on something worse. Unwanted. And yet Eleanor had still come. Not for the gala. Not for the family crest embossed in gold above the stage. She had come because the Vale Foundation was being honored for community restoration, and she knew exactly how hollow those words were. She had helped build the early outreach proposals years ago, before her name was quietly removed, before her ideas were rebranded and handed to polished people with better enemies and colder smiles. She had not come begging to belong. She had come to witness. Vivian tilted her head, watching for the wound to land. "Honestly, Eleanor, this whole tragic resilience act is exhausting." Eleanor finally looked up. Her eyes did not flash. They steadied. That was what made Vivian's smile tighten. Across the room, beneath the low amber light of a chandelier that looked almost ecclesiastical from below, another man had gone still. Lucian Cross stood near the far end of the ballroom beside 2 men who never needed introductions and never smiled in photographs. His tuxedo was severe, black on black, the kind of tailoring that made stillness look dangerous. People spoke to him in lowered voices even when music was playing. He was the kind of man newspapers called a financier when they were afraid and an underworld baron when they were honest. Crystal chandeliers burned above the ballroom like captive stars, throwing cold light across silk gowns, diamond bracelets, and the kind of smiles that only existed where cruelty was considered refinement. The insult still hung in the air, sharp and public. Eleanor stood where her sister had left her, shoulders square by force alone, one hand tightening around the stem of an untouched champagne flute she had no intention of drinking. Around her, people pretended to study centerpieces and orchestra stands, but their eyes kept returning to her the way people looked at a car wreck they were relieved had not happened to them. Then the current in the room changed. Not loudly, not all at once, just enough for heads to begin turning in one direction, for conversations to collapse mid-sentence, for a waiter carrying a silver tray to slow without realizing it. Lucian Cross moved through the crowd with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never once needed permission to enter any space on Earth. No one stepped in front of him. No one made the mistake of trying. Vivian saw him first. For a single beat, triumph flashed across her face. Men like Lucian noticed women like her, not women like Eleanor. Men like Lucian collected power, beauty, obedience, and leverage. That was the world she believed in because it had always rewarded her for believing in it. So Vivian adjusted her shoulders, tipped her chin, and smiled the smile she reserved for rich predators. Lucian walked straight past her. The air seemed to leave the room. His shoes stopped in front of Eleanor. Up close, he looked even more severe than rumor allowed. Dark hair brushed back, cuff links like black ice, a face cut into stillness so complete it made other men fidget. But his gaze, when it settled on her, did not skim or appraise. It held. It recognized. "Miss Vale," he said. Not girl. Not sweetheart. Not the invisible nothing her sister had just tried to make her become. Miss Vale. Eleanor blinked once, startled less by his presence than by the fact that he knew her name. A silence spread in widening circles. Vivian gave a strained little laugh. "Mr. Cross, I'm so sorry. My sister can be dramatic, and she has a habit of lingering where she doesn't belong. That should have rescued the scene. In rooms like this, money usually forgave cruelty if cruelty was delivered with polish." Lucian did not look at her. Instead, he reached to the passing waiter, lifted the untouched flute from Eleanor's hand, and set it down on the tray as if removing evidence from a crime scene. "You shouldn't have to hold something just to avoid folding your hands," he said quietly. The sentence hit harder than a shouted defense. It meant he had seen everything. The humiliation, the performance, the survival. Eleanor swallowed. "I'm fine." "No," he said. "You're standing." A tiny crack opened behind her ribs. No one in this family ever made that distinction. If she was not on the floor, not crying, not begging, then she was called fine. Across the marble expanse, the orchestra continued to play, but the notes had turned thin, almost embarrassed. Guests angled themselves closer without seeming to move. Lucian's bodyguards remained at a distance, expressionless, yet the perimeter around this moment was unmistakable. Vivian stepped forward now, control slipping under the lacquer. "Eleanor, don't make a scene." Under the chandeliers, power had its own temperature. It cooled the air around certain people, bent conversation before a word was spoken, and made silk-clad men twice as rich stand straighter without understanding why. The orchestra kept moving through its waltz, but the ballroom's true rhythm had shifted elsewhere, toward the black-clad figure near the marble column whose stillness unsettled more than shouting ever could. Lucian Thorne did not need to raise his hand to command a room. Fear had already done the introduction for him. Vivian heard it before she fully saw it. The change in the crowd's breathing, the tiny collapse of laughter at the edge of the dance floor, the way servers lowered their eyes as if some old instinct had passed through them all at once. Her spine locked. She had spent the entire evening arranging proximity, making sure the right women were seen near the right men, making sure Eleanor remained useful and invisible at the same time. But Lucian had become the one variable no hostess could arrange. Eleanor did not move. That was what caught him. Not beauty first, though there was enough of it in the tired grace of her face. Not vulnerability either, though humiliation still clung to the air around her like smoke after a fire. It was restraint. In a ballroom swollen with people who lunged for approval, she was the only one not performing need. Her hands remained steady around the crystal tray despite the tremor that had threatened it moments earlier. Her chin stayed level. Her eyes did not dart toward the richest man in the room in hunger, or panic, or calculation. She looked like someone holding a door shut from the inside with the last of her strength and refusing to let strangers hear the breaking furniture. Lucian noticed because he had built his life studying weakness. Real weakness, useful weakness, faked weakness, weaponized weakness. Men had lied to him on leather sofas, in courtrooms, on private jets, with blood under their fingernails and prayers on their lips. Women had smiled at him with rehearsed innocence while their fathers negotiated through them. Entire families had draped greed in etiquette and called it culture. He knew what desperation looked like when it wanted something. This was not that. A senator's wife touched Lucian's sleeve then, diamond bracelets chiming softly. She offered a smile polished for front pages and whispered something about a private introduction to the foundation chair. He did not turn. A hotel investor, red-faced from too much champagne and too little dignity, hovered at his other side with a laugh prepared in advance. Lucian let both men and their importance die in the space between seconds. Across the ballroom, Eleanor felt the weight of attention shift, though she could not yet name its shape. The room had been cruel before, now it was alert. That difference mattered. Cruelty liked spectacle. Alertness feared consequence. Vivian stepped closer to her sister, lowering her voice into something meant to sound protective. "You've embarrassed yourself enough. Go upstairs. Fix your face before anyone important sees you like this." The lie in that sentence was almost elegant. Anyone important already had. Eleanor finally looked at her, and something in that gaze unsettled Vivian more than tears would have. There was no plea in it, no childish hope that blood might remember blood. A hush moved through the ballroom before the words even landed, the kind of hush that formed when cruelty was about to dress itself as honesty. Beneath the chandeliers, with violin notes thinning into the high ceiling and crystal flutes catching fractured light, Vivian let her smile sharpen by a single degree. She had failed to push Eleanor away quietly, failed to reclaim the room with poise. So she reached for something older and uglier, the wound that had always been easiest to reopen. "No one wants you here," she said, not loudly, but with enough precision that the nearest circle heard every syllable. "Not our family. Not this room. Honestly, Eleanor, no one chooses you." The line did what Vivian intended. A few mouths parted. One woman dropped her gaze into her champagne, as if embarrassment could become invisible if reflected through gold bubbles. A man near the orchestra pretended to inspect his cuff links, because looking away was cheaper than having a conscience. The insult did not explode. It spread, slow and poisonous, because this kind of society preferred elegant violence. Eleanor did not move. The tray in her hands stayed level, though her fingers had gone so cold they barely seemed attached to her body. Years of being dismissed had taught her how to stand still inside pain, how to survive a blow by refusing to give it spectacle. But this was different. This was blood making a performance out of rejection. This was childhood humiliation polished into gala language. The old instinct, to shrink, to disappear, to leave before the room could enjoy itself further, rose inside her like a command. Vivian saw it and mistook endurance for surrender. "Go," she said, louder now, a note of impatience cracking through her refinement. "Before you force everyone else to feel sorry for you." That was when the axis of the room shifted. Not with a shout, not with a slammed glass or a public threat, just the unmistakable movement of a man people tracked before they admitted they were tracking him. At the far edge of the ballroom, Lucian Vale set down his drink untouched. The amber liquid flashed once against cut crystal, then stilled. Conversation near him died first. Then the silence traveled outward in widening circles as heads turned, calculations changed, and every person with power suddenly became aware that a more dangerous form of it had just made a decision. He started walking, straight through the velvet center of the room, past the donors and heirs, past the board members who had spent years trying to decode his favor, past women who had angled their shoulders toward him all evening, and men who smiled too quickly whenever he passed. Lucian did not slow for any of them. He did not acknowledge the greetings that died in their owners' throats. He moved with that cold, measured certainty that made space open before him like doors no one remembered unlocking. The room went silent. Vivian's face changed first, not dramatically, but enough. Enough for those watching closely to see confidence thin into disbelief. She took half a step as if to intercept him, then thought better of it. Whatever control she had been performing all night began to fracture under the simple fact of his direction. He was not coming to her. He stopped beside Eleanor, not in front of her, as if she were a problem to handle. Lucian offered his hand, and the gesture was so controlled, so measured, that it made the surrounding silence feel sharper than music. The ballroom seemed to narrow around that single movement, around Eleanor standing under the chandeliers while every guest waited to see whether she would be brave enough to take it. Vivian's smile had gone rigid at the edges. She knew what this meant, not a courtesy, not a mistake, but a public choice. "Dance with me," Lucian said, his voice low enough to feel private and loud enough for the nearest tables to hear. Eleanor looked at his hand, as if it were a question no one had ever asked her before. For one suspended breath, she did not move. The old habit of refusing attention, of shrinking before it could hurt, rose in her like instinct. But the room was watching, and Lucian was not offering pity. He was offering space. That difference mattered. Then her fingers settled into his. A murmur moved across the ballroom like wind over glass. A woman people had been trained to overlook was now standing at the center of the room with the Underworld Baron at her side, and no one could pretend it was accidental. Lucian guided her forward with one hand at her waist, firm but careful, as if he understood that dignity could be bruised by even the lightest misstep. The orchestra faltered, then found the rhythm again. "Don't look at them," he murmured. "Look at me." The sentence struck harder than any insult ever had, because it was not possession. It was protection. Eleanor lifted her chin, and when she met his eyes, something in her posture changed. The hesitation left her shoulders. The room saw it happen. Vivian did too. Her jealousy sharpened into something almost ugly, because this was not merely attention stolen from her. It was authority surrendered to Eleanor in front of everyone she had used to measure herself against. A few guests glanced toward Vivian, then away again, suddenly uncertain which woman held more weight in the room. Lucian's interest was no passing impulse. It was deliberate, and that realization spread faster than gossip. The dance carried them through the light, one slow turn after another, while the rest of the ballroom seemed to retreat behind a pane of invisible glass. Lucian never rushed her, never displayed her, never once treated her like an ornament passed between powerful men. He moved with restraint, and that restraint made the gesture more devastating than spectacle. In a room built on performance, he was making respect look more dangerous than wealth. Vivian stepped forward at last, her voice sweetened to conceal the strain beneath it. "Lucian, I think you may have forgotten whose guest she is." "Not at all," he said without looking away from Eleanor. "I know exactly who she is." The answer landed cleanly, and the room absorbed it in silence. Not a single laugh followed. Not a single guest dared offer one, because now everyone understood that Eleanor's value was no longer up for debate, and the woman who had mocked her had just been forced to watch the reversal begin. Lucian guided Eleanor through one final turn, and when the music softened, he did not let go immediately. He lowered his head slightly, speaking only to her. "Stay near me tonight." The request was quiet. The effect was not. The air in the corridor beyond the ballroom felt colder, stripped of music and polished smiles, as if the mansion itself had exhaled the truth. Lucian led Eleanor past a row of dark oil paintings and stopped beneath a brass wall sconce, where the light fell hard and clean on his face. For a moment, the great noise of the gala remained behind them, muffled by heavy doors and thicker secrets. Then he reached inside his jacket and drew out a folded set of papers, the edges worn from being opened too many times. "This family is drowning," he said. Eleanor looked at the pages but did not touch them. The numbers, names, and signatures meant nothing at first, and then everything all at once. Debts, missed payments, a private arrangement with men who did not forgive delay. Her name, written where it should never have appeared, in a line of future obligations that made her stomach tighten. Vivian had not merely insulted her tonight. The woman had been arranging her like property. Lucian's jaw tightened as he watched her read. "Your sister knew there was a gap in the Vale accounts. Your father tried to cover it. Now others are deciding what gets sold to keep the lie alive." Eleanor's fingers closed around the paper before she realized she had moved. The hallway seemed to tilt. She had spent so long being treated as the spare daughter, the quiet one, the one to ignore, that no one had bothered to ask whether she could understand a trap when it was laid in front of her. Now the trap had a price, and it carried her name. "Why tell me?" she asked. Lucian's eyes stayed on hers. "Because they were going to use you to close it." The words landed with a weight more dangerous than any insult in the ballroom. Not because they were loud, but because they were plain. Eleanor felt anger rise first, then something harder and steadier beneath it. Fear wanted her to step back. Humiliation wanted her to look down. Instead, she lifted her chin and read the last page again, slower this time, as if daring the truth to shrink. A door clicked softly at the far end of the hall. Both of them turned. Vivian stood there in silver satin, one hand resting on the frame, her expression arranged into sweet disbelief. "I wondered where you'd gone," she said, though her eyes were already on the papers. "Did he show you the family's little troubles, Eleanor? How generous of him. Or did he think you'd be easier to manage once you were frightened?" The smile she wore was elegant enough to fool strangers and sharp enough to draw blood. Eleanor saw, in a single instant, that her sister had followed them on purpose. Not for protection, for control. Lucian folded the documents once and slid them back into his coat. "You should leave," he told Vivian. Vivian let out a soft laugh. "And let her believe she has a choice?" The question hung there, ugly and exact. Then Eleanor stepped forward. It was not a large movement, but it changed the corridor. The woman everyone had expected to bend, blush, or break now stood squarely in the light, holding Lucian's gaze for one brief second before turning it on her sister. You do not get to bargain with my life anymore. Vivian's face flickered. A murmur moved faster than perfume in the minutes after the corridor confrontation, slipping through velvet drapes, champagne clusters, and the polished hunger of people who had come to the gala pretending they admired grace when what they truly loved was weakness. By the time the doors to the ballroom opened again, the story had already begun changing shape in other mouths. Eleanor had not simply left the floor with Lucian, they said. She had cornered him, pressured him, attached herself to danger with the desperation of a woman who knew she had no other way into power. The lie was elegant because it used the oldest cruelty in the room. When a woman rose too suddenly, society preferred to believe she had traded something shameful for the privilege. Vivian did not rush. That was what made her dangerous. Near the string quartet, beneath a wash of amber light, she drifted from guest to guest with a face composed in sisterly concern, lowering her voice at just the right moment, touching one sleeve, then another, as if reluctant to speak at all. She never said Eleanor was immoral. She only wondered whether Eleanor was frightened, whether grief and isolation had made her vulnerable, whether Lucian had noticed how unstable she had become. By the time the rumor completed its first circle, pity had sharpened into scandal. Men pretended not to stare. Women stared openly. Across the room, Lucian caught the shift before he caught the words. Power had taught him to read silence more accurately than conversation, and this silence had edge in it. It spread in little breaks of eye contact, in interrupted laughter, in glances that snapped away when Eleanor turned. Steel entered his expression. He started toward her. Don't. The word stopped him. Not because it was loud, because it came from Eleanor, and for the first time that night, it did not sound like survival. It sounded like decision. The orchestra moved into a brighter piece, too bright for the feeling settling over the floor. At the far end of the ballroom, an event coordinator approached the dais with visible nerves and handed an envelope to the master of ceremonies. A special recognition had been added to the program, the man announced. A private donor had requested that Eleanor be thanked publicly for her years of quiet service to her family after their father's decline. Several heads turned with manufactured tenderness. On the surface, it was praise. Underneath, it was a trap built with white gloves. Bring her to the stage. Force her into the light. Make her deny nothing without seeming ungrateful. Make Lucian's attention look like charity given to a pitiful dependent. Vivian watched from below the chandelier, eyes bright and patient. That was the moment Eleanor understood the full shape of the attack. Her sister was not trying to insult her in private anymore. She was trying to define her permanently before the only audience that mattered to their world. Not a woman of dignity. Not a woman chosen. A burden. A household ghost. A cautionary tale in borrowed silk. For one beat, old instinct reached for retreat. Smile. Endure. Leave quietly. Then another instinct rose and cut across it. She walked to the dais on her own. The room followed her with the hungry stillness of a held breath. Silver flashed at wrists. Crystal trembled faintly against trays. Lucian did not interfere. That restraint cost him. Above the ballroom, a chandelier burned with the kind of cold brilliance that made every lie look polished. The charity auction had resumed by the time Eleanor reached the dais, though no one in the room was truly interested in the paintings anymore. Attention had narrowed to her, to the trembling stemware, to Vivian standing near the front with one hand clasped too tightly around her silver clutch, and to Lucian at the edge of the crowd, still as carved stone, watching what Eleanor would choose when no one carried her there. A trustee in white tie offered a brittle smile and tried to recover the evening. Miss Vale has graciously agreed to say a few words on behalf of the family foundation. The sentence landed like a command dressed as courtesy. That was the trap. Dress her in gratitude. Make her bless the machine that had fed on her silence. If she refused, she would seem unstable. If she complied, the room would help bury her alive. Eleanor took the microphone without looking at the trustee. The metal was cool against her palm. Her breathing steadied once, then again. Across the glossy floor, faces lifted toward her with the same appetite they had shown for her humiliation, only now it wore diamonds. My family, she said, and the room softened, expecting surrender. Then her eyes moved to Vivian. My family has always understood the price of appearances. The softness vanished. A ripple passed through the tables. Not loud. Worse, interested. Near the front, their mother gave the smallest warning shake of her head. Their father's jaw hardened. He had the look of a man calculating whether a scene could still be contained by force, money, or shame. Tonight, for the first time, none of his usual instruments reached the stage before Eleanor's voice did. They taught me, she continued, that a woman could be traded politely if the room was elegant enough, dressed well enough, introduced with the right smile. They taught me that survival should look like obedience. Vivian stepped forward at once. Eleanor, that's enough. No, Eleanor said. One word. Flat. Final. The ballroom went still. She reached into the fold of her evening wrap and withdrew a cream envelope, slightly creased from being carried too long, too close. Several people recognized the family seal before they recognized the danger. Lucian's expression did not change, but something sharpened behind his eyes. This is the agreement my father tried to place in front of me 3 weeks ago, Eleanor said. A private arrangement. Sign away any claim to the estate. Accept a monthly allowance. Remain out of public view. In exchange, the family would preserve its reputation and announce that I had chosen a quiet life for reasons of health. Shock traveled more cleanly than gossip. A few guests sat back as if distance might protect them from what they were hearing. Their father strode toward the dais. That document is not for public discussion. Eleanor did not retreat. Neither was my life. That never seemed to stop any of you. A murmur broke open around the room. Phones stayed lowered. This crowd was too old, too careful for that. But they watched with the concentration of people realizing the entertainment had become evidence. Vivian climbed the first step of the dais, smile fixed, voice low and vicious. Do not do this here. Vivian climbed the first step of the dais, smile fixed, voice low and vicious. Do not do this here. Eleanor looked at her sister for one long second, and whatever had once trembled inside her did not tremble now. The ballroom lights struck the emerald at her throat and turned it into a blade of green fire. Around them, crystal caught the chandelier's cold glare. Silver trays stilled in midair. Even the quartet near the far wall had faltered into a thin, uncertain silence. Lucian remained below the dais, one hand resting loosely at his side, not rescuing, not interrupting, giving her the one thing no one in that family ever had. Room. Eleanor lifted the document in her hand. You're right, she said, and her voice carried farther than Vivian's had. This should never have become public. It should have stayed private, inside a family that still knew what shame was. A ripple moved through the crowd. Then she placed the pages flat against the auction lectern and turned them so the board members seated near the stage could see the signatures clearly. Not gossip, not a plea. Paper, ink, dates, transfers. Her father's foundation seal. The room went still. The housing grant in my mother's name was redirected 3 times, Eleanor said. First into a shell account managed by my father's office. Then into a holding company tied to Vivian's event firm. Then into tonight's charity ledger to cover losses no donor here was ever told about. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. I was kept quiet because I knew where the first authorization came from. I was kept dependent because I would have asked where the money went. Vivian's smile finally cracked. That is absurd. No, Eleanor said. Absurd was telling me I was difficult to love while using my name to make theft look compassionate. Several heads turned at once toward the chairman of the foundation. He had gone pale beneath his tan. One of the older donors reached for the lectern, scanning the first page with narrowed eyes, then the second. A woman from the legal advisory board stood so abruptly her chair legs scraped against marble. Lucian still did not move. That restraint cost him in a different way now. Every instinct in him was built for force, for endings delivered clean and immediate. But this was not his judgment to pronounce. It was hers. And because he stayed back, everyone in that room understood the truth with merciless clarity. Eleanor was not being spoken for. Eleanor was speaking. Her father rose from his table at last. You are emotional, he said, trying for authority and landing somewhere closer to panic. You have misunderstood internal restructuring. Eleanor turned toward him. Then explain why my signature appears on a release I never signed. She drew one final page from beneath the stack. That was the blow. A scanned authorization form, dated 18 months earlier, with her forged name beneath a transfer approval and Vivian copied on the correspondence. Beside the forged signature sat a handwritten note from their father's chief accountant. Need Eleanor uninvolved until after Gala season. Someone cursed under their breath. Vivian lunged for the papers. Eleanor stepped back first. Not Lucian. Eleanor. The movement was small, but it changed everything. For years she had been the one cornered, managed, repositioned like furniture in rooms built for other people's comfort.